Hi Heikki, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks a lot.
Can you introduce yourself to our listeners for anyone who doesn't know you?
My name is Heikki Ikäheimo. I'm a senior lecturer in philosophy at UNSW, and I'm originally from Finland. I've been here now a bit, 15 years actually. Spent 3 years in Germany before coming here. That's who I am.
I was sort of wondering, what has your studies of Hegel sort of taught you about your own life and anything of that sort?
Yeah, right. Well, there's one particular theme that is being very central in all of my philosophical work since pretty much from the beginning. That is a theme from Hegel. It's not only from his thought, but it's most famous from Hegel's thought. That is the theme of recognition, mutual recognition or intersubjective recognition, and that's why that kind of caught my attention. That theme was exactly, I think, because it is so applicable in my own life, in life general, in what I experience in my life. The relationship between one's own understanding of oneself and then the perceptions of others of oneself. That's kind of the main kind of dynamics that this recognition stuff is about, and the mutuality of this interdependence of one's self-perception and perception of the world, of the perceptions of others. And I thought that was, when I kind of bumped into that topic, I thought that was incredibly insightful. There's also the kind of more personal, probably kind of national thing. Coming from a small country, relatively young country, the question is kind of in the national psyche always, what do they think of us? Do they take us seriously? Do they think we are good in this or that? It's kind of a small country obsession too. So it's not surprising someone from Finland might be interested in that topic. But definitely that is a theme that has an incredible array of applications to all kinds of different areas of life, and that's why I found it so interesting and kind of has remained with me ever since. Probably will remain for a long time. That's that's maybe the main topic, kind of mainstay in my thinking from Hegel. But more broadly, Hegel is a non-dualist thinker. Hegel always thinks of the connection of things. He's never satisfied with kind of analyzing, dividing things into black and white or good and bad or or yes and no, etc. He's always interested in the connections of things and the kind of interdependencies, etc., which I find again an incredibly useful way to think of social life and everything else in reality. And he's also a holistic thinker. So he emphasizes the importance of understanding everything in its relations to other things and in the broader context. And I find that those very important insights. Not only understand the individual, myself or any other individual in the social context, but understanding, say, a particular country in the context of the world system, understanding humanity or the human species in the context of nature at large, etc. Very, very important ways of seeing things that I find in Hegel.
How would you say, from the first instances of Hegel coming up with his ideas of recognition and the other thinkers with him during that time, and the current state of what we think of recognition and what most philosophers today think of recognition, how would you say it has progressed or evolved over the years?
Right. So one thing is that Hegel does not have a theory of recognition. It's not a theme that he kind of develops at any length, at any particular place in his writing. It's just something kind of pops up again and again in some crucial places in his work, and this is so has resulted in this topic kind of resurfacing in European philosophy again and again, in ways that are not strictly to be found in Hegel. People have just used the general idea in different productive ways. One example is Alexander Koshev, the very important Russian French thinker and teacher, in whose lectures on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, many, or if not most, of the immediate post-war French intellectuals sat. So they were very much influenced by his understanding of recognition. And for him, the struggle for recognition was basically the kind of engine of history. So he was thinking of human history in those terms. But also but another place, not totally disconnected, where the general theme of recognition has played a role is in broadly speaking Marxist thinking. Hegel has these famous figures of the master and slave, the struggle of recognition between the master and slave, which very easily kind of translates into think of class relations, etc. But then from the 90s, there's a more recent resurgence of thinking about recognition in the context of identity and difference. So Charles Taylor wrote this famous paper in 1992, which basically deals with recognition for ethnic minorities and what that could mean. It could mean kind of recognition in the sense of attributing equal rights, or then it could mean recognition in the sense of somehow appreciating or supporting the particular cultural identity. In this case, the French speakers in Canada, but could be equally well be a particular gender group or particular ethnic group or whatever. So this kind of recognition thinking has been associated with questions of identity since the 90s, but that is only one application of the idea, so to say. So it's kind of general idea which has been utilized in many interesting and productive ways after Hegel.
Yeah, and one of the philosophers that also touches on recognition is Axel Honneth, who we learned towards the end of your social critique class. And I was kind of wondering whether you could explain to us sort of what drew you to Axel Honneth in particular and his concepts of recognition.
Yeah.
And I know you also wrote a book in response or in tandem with his ideas.
Yeah. What originally drew me to his thinking was just the fact that he published this book, The Struggle for Recognition, while I was an undergraduate student. So thanks to him, and then also some work by Charles Taylor, that was a kind of big topic in those years, in the late 90s, etc. And he was the big name at that point. And I had some, through my teacher, some contacts to Germany, also to other German philosophers who had already earlier dealt with the topic. Ludwig Sieb is kind of grand old man in Germany of thinking about recognition the last decades, and I had, through my teacher, Jussi, connections to him and others, but then also through coincidences and connections, a connection to Axel Honneth was then kind of came up. I met him a couple of times and invited him to Jyväskylä, which is the place in Finland where I studied, and we had a workshop with him. And his work was just incredibly interesting and productive in my mind, and there still is around this topic. I mean, the basic ideas of the book Struggle for Recognition was originally in 92 in German, and then the mid-90s in English. It's basically a theory of a good society. A theory of a good society, according to Honneth, is one in which people have reasonable opportunities to receive fair recognition for what they are, what they do, also for their rights, etc. And why this is important is precisely because of the effect of recognition or lack thereof to people's conceptions of themselves. So if one hasn't had the experience of being respected as an equal member of society, for instance, with equal rights with others. It's very difficult to have this kind of robust self-respect that one can kind of stand up straight among other people. Similarly, if one hasn't had the experience of one's contributions being properly acknowledged or seen as valuable or appreciated as valuable, it's not that easy to kind of see them as valuable oneself. One needs to have this kind of validation of one's value, of the worth of what one is doing from others. And if one doesn't receive adequate recognition, then it's difficult to have these positive conceptions of oneself, and that will end up having effects on how well one is able to live one's life, basically. Realize one's kind of know and have the courage to think of what I want to do in life, and the courage to push through and kind of basically live with self-confidence, self-respect, etc., among others. So there's that kind of basic idea of a good society as one which provides people recognition, therefore the psychological means for satisfying self-realization, agency, etc. But there's also a kind of political theory according to which we can look at social struggles, say the struggles for women's rights, struggles by gender minorities, etc., from this point of view of struggle for recognition. The idea there is that they are not merely kind of strategic struggles for some material or other goods, but they are precisely struggles for having a kind of adequate status in the eyes of others, being respected, being valued, etc. So I think it's a really important perspective to social movements and social struggles. So there are many fruitful ideas in that book. I myself developed the ideas in slightly different ways, but it's been one of the main influences on me on my thinking of recognition by Hornet.
Does that at all touch with what you wrote in Manifesto of Critical Naturalism? Yeah. So there's this Manifesto of Critical Naturalism that I co-wrote or co-authored with colleagues, Emmanuel Renaud from France, Italo Testa from Italy, and Arvi Särkelä and Federica Gregorato from Switzerland. Arvi is actually from Finland originally, and Federica is from Italy, but we co-authored this piece during COVID. We were meant to planned to meet in Paris, but then COVID happened, and then we ended up working online for a couple of years, producing this text that is now published, which basically argues that critical social philosophy, social thought, or critical theory, mainly but not only in the Frankfurt School tradition, needs to take our relationship with and dependence on nature much more seriously than it has done. There has been a lot of kind of skepticism and worry about naturalizing things. One of which, and many of those are perfectly understandable worries. I mean, there is this kind of ideological reductive naturalism that tries to justify, say, gender differences by appealing to putative natural differences, etc. That would be an ideological way of, or ideological naturalism. But we argue there that these legitimate worries should not lead to one thoroughly discrediting any reference to our dependence on nature or natural conditions. So basically we just want to argue that we really need to reintroduce our utter dependence on nature into critical theory or critical social thought, mainly in the Frankfurt School tradition, but also more broadly. And how has its reception been to fellow peers? Or?
Yeah, so it's very new. It only came out a few months ago in the journal Crisis. It's on online journal, and the next issue will contain some 15 or so responses to it by other people, and it remains to be seen what they say about. So it's still too early to say much about it, but I mean it has drawn quite a bit of attention, and it will appear, or parts of it, the 11 theses on critical naturalism that are part of the manifesto, will appear in several languages soon, including Finnish. I made the translation, and I think Italo made an Italian translation, etc. So there will be reception in different countries as well, and we'll just see what comes out of that. I imagine part of the reception will be kind of academic in nature, that people are criticizing this or that theoretical aspect of it, or pointing out other authors who may have said the same already. So there's the kind of academic side to it, but hopefully it will have a little bit broader impact as well in the humanities and social science more broadly.
What do you think would be one of the few implications of this theory that could apply more broadly? How would it, I guess, how would its repercussions manifest?
Well, I guess there's the general question of how do changes at the level of philosophy or theory, how do they affect social changes? And often the influence is very indirect, and often will take a long time. But basically we are talking about kind of paradigm shifts in thinking. And that's where philosophy is really of crucial importance. So kind of most of our basic ways, or many of our basic ways of thinking about human life are were originally articulated by philosophers at some point, somewhere. And like a basic ideologies or isms or worldviews are all kind of refer to this, or kind of philosophical ways of thinking. So thinking in terms of paradigm shift, what we are doing in the Manifesto of Critical Naturalists is contributing into paradigm shift that we think is going on at the moment towards taking our dependence on nature much more seriously. How that will then affect the organization of social life, social process remains to be seen. But basically, I think it's fair to say that much of kind of the affluent Western or global northern countries have lived for the last many decades under the kind of illusion that the way we organize our economy or our life more generally has no natural kind of limits. I mean, it's kind of sounds stupid to say that, and everyone knows that it does have limits. But the system is organized in a way that presupposes that there are actually no limits. That the resources are unlimited, and we can keep on pushing as much pollution as we want, etc. And there's a kind of this growing appreciation that's not the case. But it has to go throughout all areas of society, all of the ways in which we think and organize social life, including economy, our ways of living, agriculture, all of that. And it's going to be a huge paradigm shift and huge revolution in the way in which we organize our societies, and it's just absolutely necessary if we want to avoid the worst imaginable crisis or catastrophes ahead.
It's interesting to hear sort of, I guess, the indirect implications of this topic of recognition, because in comparison to other, I suppose, more popular philosophical traditions or concepts or ideas today, such as like Stoicism, which is very, I think, individualistic, and it's very focused on you, whereas hearing you talk about the ideas surrounding recognition, it seems very socially related and has almost a different sort of effect with changing structures and changing dynamics and all of that. It's it's very cool to notice.
Yeah, so I think there is this kind of alternative social ontologies or ontologies of social or human life. They are more individualistic and more kind of holistic, if you want, ontologies. And much of kind of Western liberal political thought assumes a very individualistic or atomistic ontology of human being. And there's kind of, it's not surprising that Stoicism is kind of in fashion these days. It kind of fits into this extremely individualistic way of thinking of social life, which kind of liberal capitalism or capitalism encourages as well. And famously, Stoicism was born in a time in Roman or Mediterranean history where the individual didn't have much of a say in how the society was organized. So basically it says that whatever happens to you, the most important thing is what you think or how you organize what's inside of your mind or in your head, etc. So kind of extremely individualist in some regards. But then there is this tradition of thinking of human life as essentially social, which doesn't start from Hegel, but Hegel is definitely one of the main proponents of that way of thinking. I think that is not only kind of a healthier, more useful, but also the more truthful view. And we start thinking about it, then we are perfectly aware that we are dependent on other people in anything or everything that we do, basically. And we need to take that seriously in thinking about human life, in my view.
One of the first sort of thoughts that popped in my head as soon as we started this topic on recognition was, I wonder how would a Hegelian explain solitary confinement as a punishment, or sort of the idea that humans by themselves, say stuck on an island, would go crazy. Yeah, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it is an extreme form of torture, exactly because of this dependence of human beings on other human beings, on communication with other human beings, on the other human being sort of a mirror and also a check to what I'm thinking, what I'm saying. And other people basically keep us from going insane. I mean, they may also often contribute very much to our going insane, but if there's no one else there to check what's going on with me, where my thoughts are going, etc., then that's really troubling, very, very precarious, difficult situation, and it can be extremely painful, horrible suffering, I imagine.
I sort of wonder, like, perhaps I don't have the idea totally right, but Sartre is really famous for saying that, other people is hell. And I sort of wonder, within the contrasts of that, his idea of that perhaps has been taken out of context, but in surface level seems like he's very precarious about the aspect of recognition regarding other people's judgment on him or recognition of him, because I think if I have the idea right, it can trap an individual to or put pressures on an individual to conform to a particular way.
Yeah.
Whereas, I sort of wonder what would be the Hegelian view of that same concept.
Yeah, that's interesting. Sartre was one of those intellectuals who sat in Alexander Kozhev's lecture that I mentioned earlier, and he takes up this theme of recognition from Hegel through Kozhev, but he gives it a very particular kind of reading, and his premises are kind of extremely individualistic. So on his presentation in the book Being and Nothingness, the look of the other is this persecuting look. So the basic idea of Sartre's humanism is that, as he puts it, existence precedes essence, meaning that we as human beings have this capacity to kind of transcend any given definition or description or essence that we may be kind of given And the idea there is that the look of the other tries to pin me down to particular tries to pigeonhole me into particular identities, etc. And therefore, it's kind of the look of the other is a hell. Now, there's insight in that, definitely, so that other people may do that. Often that's the case, that other people see me in light, or kind of in light of particular labels, or pigeonhole me, etc., and that's a problem. But obviously that's not always the case. That's not the only thing that the look of the other does. The look of the other is equally kind of constitutive of me having a human mind at all. This kind of constant kind of feedback loops and mutual relation with other. Without those, I would not have even developed a human mind who could be thinking of anything, or any of the stuff that Sartre is thinking about. So it's kind of interesting application, but it's just really one tiny corner of this kind of whole gamut of what the recognition stuff and the kind of essential relationality of human being is about.
And if I'm not mistaken, Sartre was an indirect student of Hegel, wasn't he? He studied a lot of
so he sat in these lectures by Alexander Koshev, so he learned a bit of Hegel from there. But apparently he never really studied Hegel. He didn't know much about what Hegel actually wrote at that point. So he was an independent thinker, and he came up with his own system and just took influences from all kinds of places. And one of the influences was the general idea of the kind of recognition or perception or look of the other as having some sort of important influence on the individual.
On the other hand, was Heidegger a more direct student of Hegel and someone? Did he?
No. I mean Hegel died in 1830, was 31 anyway. So I mean these people were writing about 100 years later. So none of them were direct students of Hegel. And Hegel wasn't a huge influence in German philosophy, even when Heidegger was studying kind of Kant or neo-Kantianism, those kind of non-Hegelian forms of thinking were much more in vogue. Husserl's phenomenology was a big thing, and Heidegger was Husserl's student.
That's right.
Yeah, Husserl didn't know apparently a lot about Hegel either. So and he wasn't very well informed about Hegel. Heidegger had written interesting things about Hegel, so he did study Hegel, but he writes about everything from his very particular perspective again. So it's kind of a great thinker in a way, which often means that they don't really do much justice to other thinkers. They just kind of think of their ideas from their own perspective.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see, I suppose, how these ideas then manifest and has its own implications, and following the logical, I guess, constraints that they put on their own perspective and theories, and how that sort of evolves.
There is the kind of the general theme of intersubjectivity here, which I think is relevant. That kind of Sartre's understanding of intersubjectivity in being and nothing is mainly negative. That's kind of the persecuting relation with the other that the intersubjectivity is about. Heidegger arguably has hard time in understanding intersubjectivity as somehow constitutive of our being. So he has this in his earlier work on being and time, the kind of ontology of Dasein, basically structure of human existence, and I would argue that relations with others is kind of a secondary topic. They're secondary concern. They're not really thoroughly worked out, and it is also individualistic in a kind of existentialist way, somewhat similar to Sartre, in that the influence of the others is mainly or primarily negative. The influence of others on Heidegger's view is that they are the they. or kind of the bad, inauthentic way of existing or living one's life is living like like they live, like everyone else lives, so to say. So it kind of paints this picture of others as this kind of mass that one should not be drawn to. One should find one's authentic individual way of being, and that's the way of living authentically. And then what is the role of relations to others in that authentic way of living? Heidegger doesn't have much to say about that. That was probably the reason why I eventually then became left Heidegger behind, because it seemed to be that he doesn't have much to say about that thing, which I think for me is the most interesting thing actually.
It's interesting. There's probably a wild oversimplification of the matter, and one that Hegel himself would probably dislike, this non-duality. But it seems that these two branches then of existentialism in comparison to Hegelianism, or more loosely just the concept of recognition itself, are very diametrically opposed because of the way they view others and whether that has a positive or negative impact. I was sort of curious as well because I'm not aware of many students, not directly, but sort of philosophers who are influenced by Hegel, except for Slavoj Žižek, who is very, very popular amongst sort of me and my friends and sort of the younger generation. And I'm not, partly is because he's just so eccentric, but I also sort of wonder if you're familiar with his works at all. How do you see, what do you think is his interpretation of Hegel and how he has developed those ideas?
I have to say I don't know Žižek very well. I just mainly follow him on social media. I've read some things from him, but he's very much influenced by Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, which, by the way, was also one of the French intellectuals who sat on Alexander Kozhev's lectures on Hegel and got the idea of recognition from there, and it has a big impact on his psychoanalytical thinking. And the kind of one of the fundamental ideas there is this idea that recognition is always misrecognition, and it's kind of somewhat similar. There's some similarities to the Sartrean view, in which the view of the other is this kind of persecuting view, etc. She's actually very much influenced by that way of thinking of Hegel, but I have to say I haven't really followed much of the details of his reading of Hegel. It's so fast and it's so all over the place that all the kind of difficult to follow. Very interesting thinker, very productive thinker too, and very entertaining thinker. Sometimes the kind of entertainment aspect kind of takes, in my view, a bit too big a role, but definitely someone interesting to follow.
I was kind of curious as well now that you mentioned it. What regarding sort of the relationship between psychoanalysis and philosophy, because we briefly touched on that, I think, with Adorno, was it, in social critique, your class.
Yeah.
And I've always been kind of curious ever since what the relationship between psychoanalysis and philosophy was, especially with someone like Lacan. I've tried so many times to research and somewhat understand his how he was influenced by psychoanalytics, but it's beyond me. Yeah.
No, Lacan is very difficult to read, but there are other thinkers in psychoanalysis and development of psychology who take very seriously this interdependence. Obviously, all psychoanalysts would take that very seriously. But the basic idea of recognition is something that very much resonates with psychoanalytic thinking. I think. I mean, it's kind of a commonplace in psychoanalytic thinking that the views of others will have an incredible impact on my view on myself. So there's an obvious connection there through this general idea of recognition or kind of constitutive intersubjectivity between psychoanalysis and then social philosophical thought in the kind of way in which I think about it. So I mean, one thing to say about philosophy or kind of academic disciplines is that sometimes people are very kind of protective of the boundaries between disciplines. In the area where I work, which is social philosophy, critical social philosophy, by its very nature, these disciplinary boundaries aren't very tight, and I think that's very healthy. I don't think we should be kind of religious about disciplinary boundaries. So whatever is useful from psychoanalysis for understanding social processes, we should just draw on that. Obviously, we should avoid a kind of reductionist understanding, a kind of monocausal understanding on which everything about social reality can be understood through this or that psychoanalysis theory, be it Lacanian or whatever. That would be the wrong interpretation. But basically, understanding the human situation and the space of human beings in the world requires drawing in any sort of useful body of information, whichever discipline it is from.
Especially, I think, regarding sort of living the good life, especially I find the correlations or the relationship between psychology and philosophy to be, very natural.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's not just within philosophy itself, but in psychology it can be very restrictive too, in that sense. Learning about psychology at UNSW is very science-driven,
Right.
and scientific, and just responds to a lot of different things. But the reputation of trying to assert itself as like a very hard science is very palpable. I think that's been one of the things that was a shock to me when I started studying psychology, was just how rigid it was. And in some ways, as someone with clinical aspirations, or at least at the time, it was very disappointing in some ways, because it was very very rigid, and it's got nothing to do with social interactions or sort of understanding a human being, at least in terms of life, rather than in terms of biology and neurology and all that sort of stuff.
So often hear from psychology students in my class when we talk about Freud or psychoanalysis, kind of that's not real science, or that's not real psychology, and that's what one often learns in studying psychology in universities, and part of that is the kind of felt need to defend the kind of sciencey status of that discipline. But more generally, in kind of abstracting from that, there is kind of more science, kind of natural scientific perspective to psychology, and then a more humanistic perspective to psychology. And the latter one is more interested in interpretation of what's going on and what's crucial for human mind and personality development, etc. And it is the latter kind of perspective which very easily then works together with philosophical perspectives.
I wonder if, say, psychology has almost disregarded Freud and his ideas, or most of it anyways, of his ideas of psychoanalysis. I wonder then, has it been the same response by the philosophical community, and whether, because they operate on different realms and have different goals, that perhaps philosophy is still able to entertain some thoughts from psychoanalysis that, although it might be scientifically irrelevant or disinteresting, that in philosophy is actually a fruitful area to.
Yeah, though one has to say that this there's kind of similar divide within philosophy, broadly speaking, too. That there are more kind of science-like or sciencey approaches in philosophy, and then more humanities focused, or kind of more humanities-like approaches in philosophy. Much of contemporary philosophy of mind, say, is naturalistic in a reductive sense. Basically, tries to understand the human mind in terms of natural processes, causal processes, mechanical processes, etc. Tries to reduce those processes to what the natural sciences say the world is like. That is a very alive approach in contemporary philosophy. And then there is this more humanist kind of hermeneutic way of thinking about philosophy. Maybe that is an important divide within the philosophy discipline. I've been very critical of the so-called analytical continental divide in philosophy. I think that's mostly a waste of people's time and energy than kind of fighting those sort of turf wars. But it has to be said that there are kind of radical differences in terms of orientation within the philosophical community, the philosophical discipline. Some are more kind of understand themselves closer to science or wanting to understand the world in terms of what the science is about the world, and others are more drawn to kind of hermeneutic, humanistic understanding. And obviously, kind of academic, scientific psychology works better with the first one, the kind of more naturalistic, in a reductive sense, approach in philosophy. Psychoanalysis works better with the more humanities focused, the humanities approach to philosophy.
What I feel like I've looked this up before. What does hermeneutic in terms of philosophy means? Yeah.
Well, by hermeneutic, I simply mean interpretation, and it has to do with meanings. So that when I talk about mental processes, the hermeneutic perspective is looking into meanings, process of meaning and association, etc. Whereas the kind of more hard science approach would be looking at the kind of at brain processes, at causal processes, etc., rather than meaning. Now there are of course attempts to reduce meaning to natural processes as well, but hermeneutics is not interested in that question whether meaningful process can be reduced somehow to causal process, etc. It's just interested in those meanings, and that's the core of what psychoanalysis works with. It works with meanings and works with kind of associations and etc. and things hidden underneath explicit consciousness, etc. Experiences and what they have meant for an individual, what they associate with, what they bring to mind, etc. So understanding psychoanalysis from that perspective is really understanding it as a hermeneutic enterprise rather than a scientific enterprise.
I think it's been an hour and a half. I was wondering whether you want to take a break or keep going.
Sure, yeah. Let's take a little break, yeah. Go on, get some water. I'm a little bit worried about to say because the university might have some views, but we can have a general chat.
Yeah, and obviously if you maybe reflect on it and you're not comfortable with
right. Yeah,
just edit that out.
Because there's something I don't know what to say to my students now, and that I want to contradict myself. Anyway.
Yeah, but I wonder sort of how AI would play in philosophy in general, not just in university studies. Because at the moment I'm not sure how capable it is of producing original thought. But
it's not. I mean, it's really the nature of the thing. I mean, there's this kind of catastrophe hypeset mindset that AI will take over the world, but none of these softwares are doing anything like that. And they're just predicting which word most likely comes after which word, etc. That's all they do. Now they don't understand anything. They don't produce anything. anything new in an interesting way. Of course, it's an interesting question. What is it to produce new thing in any case by human mind either?
Yeah,
Also.
I think. Yeah, it seems to me at least it's only generally useful in helping you maybe comprehend things and breaking things down into more digestible sort of.
Perhaps. I have to say I don't have. How we started, by the way.
Yeah.
I have to say I don't have enough experience of what it can actually do with a difficult philosophical text. Because I mean there is this thing when reads philosophical text, difficult philosophical text, one needs to get to the core ideas. And there is no formula for that. There's no kind of obvious way in how to find those core ideas. There's nothing you can give, kind of program to an algorithm that would help it to find them. It can only have this kind of formal cues, something like that. But it's difficult for me to see how an AI program like the ones that we now have could make actually a difference between what's important and what's not important. And this goes back now to the topic that we discussed earlier about meaning. We touched upon that earlier. I mean, these programs don't have a clue about meaning, and a clue about what's important. What's important, what's relevant, that is something that only a mind that has concerns can make distinctions between. We humans are concerned of various things, like Heidegger says. Sorge is a kind of this concern is a kind of constitutive feature of our existence and mind, and this we're constitutively worried or concerned of how our lives will go, etc. And that worry generally kind of sets up relevant structure. Something is relevant for those worries, other things are not relevant. Some things are more important, other things are not important. Some things are good, other things are not good. And a being or an algorithm that is not a worrying being cannot make any of those distinctions. And therefore, I am skeptical of their capacity to distinguish between what in a text is important and what is not. Unless the text is written in a simple format where there's a kind of system in which those are generally distinguished within the text. And nothing like that exists in philosophy. I don't think should exist in philosophy. It should be a creative enterprise.
Yeah, I think, I was thinking as you were saying that as well, like, there are different levels of reading in books and difficulty of those books, but generally the structure seems to be that, at least in the form of essays and stuff like that, you can get the main points from maybe, if it's well written, the introduction and the conclusion will contain a brief summary of the main points that will be discussed. But as you said, if we were to just apply this formula to an AI, it would work for all the instances that the text it's reading does have that structure. However, once it encounters a text that doesn't have that structure, it sort of just falls apart. It will just apply that formula sort of without concern of whether it is actually important. And I think it seems to me what you're saying is we have a value system to decide what's relevant.
That's right. Values are kind of normatively, broadly speaking, is really constitutive of human mind and the human way of being in the world, and it does not exist for AI. It's not a concerned being. It doesn't have values. It doesn't have priorities, etc. Except for those that can be somehow programmed into it. And that's not easy.
I wonder, semantically speaking, or maybe epistemologically speaking, how would one program values into an AI? The human equivalent of values.
Well, we can do kind of mimicking there. So I mean, I guess that's important now. Kind of technological or technically important in robotics. There's all kinds of attempts to apply robotics, say in elderly care, etc., or kind of these human relations, human service roles. And I guess you have to be able to program behavior that mimics values and cares.
Yeah.
So kind of expressions that sound like the expressions of a being that actually, say, cares about you or likes you. But of course, the thing itself cannot care or like. It just does not have a mind capable of that. It's not a being that has any values or priorities. We can make it mimic all kinds of things, but not have the real thing.
What interests me is then, I think human beings have always been able to look past certain maybe imperfections and all of that. And so I wonder whether we could get to a level where AI can mimic value systems and all these different things, but we as humans impose then the reality or the sentience of it all, because it fools us enough to the point that it replicates or mimics values well enough that we think they actually do, even though they don't.
Yeah. So these questions are live questions when say in autonomous steering cars, etc., and also in military robotics, etc. One needs to have some sort of algorithm for distinguishing between different cases, when to shoot, when not to shoot, and those algorithms, those programs have to be based or will be based on some sort of value decisions by those who program them into them, or the autonomous driving car, whether it will prior, if it sees a human being and sees something else there, which one it will hit, etc. Those kind of things will have to be written into it. But I think that concerns technology more broadly. All technology does reflect our value systems in one way or another. So that's of course perfectly possible and is happening at the moment. Now, with regard to the possibility of an artificial being that actually can care, that's an interesting challenge. I think it would have to be kind of built from the bottom up. It would have to be a living being, because only for living beings something is good and bad. And in some relevant sense, it would have to be a living being that is concerned, first of all, of its own survival. That's the kind of driving thing for all living beings. The most important thing is whether to live or flourish or to die or wither away. That's already the kind of organizing principle for plant life, and then for animal life. Now, of course, that's also problematic because that's also the root of all evil. Because my survival might mean your death, or the other way around. So starting it from there basically is kind of starting the world again, and we know that that's a nasty process. All kinds of nasty things have happened and will continue happening. So yeah.
Yeah, I wonder whether, I don't wonder actually. I'm sure that at some point someone will try to inject that sort of survival value as it's very as the most core component of an AI's mind or whatever. And I think from that point onwards, the question of whether it would be a living being and whether it's sentient would become very much more real.
Yeah. So it would be a living being in that sense that it is concerned of its own existence. And there's of course these figures in science fiction, say the computer HAL in Space Odyssey 2001 whatever that was, who wants to kill the human being because the human being wants to kill it basically or shut it down, etc.
Yeah.
So it's kind of what dystopian nightmares are made. That's how humanity will end. I don't know if there's any kind of, if it's a real option or whatever, but something to be concerned about. But anyway, I don't think this generative AI thing is doing at the moment anything like that.
Yeah, I think we're safe.
We are talking about two quite different things. Yeah.
So Final question. I like to ask this because it's very tongue-in-cheek and over cliche. But considering that I've been interviewing philosophers, I'd like to ask, what is the meaning of life? To end the podcast.
The goal of life is to do something good.
Something good in terms of how you see it, other people?
Something good for others.
Something good for others.
Yeah. As some people say, to leave the world a little better than it was when you enter it. From some little aspect. To contribute to something good. I think that's what makes life meaningful. It could be within your family. People who have children, it could be contributing to the life of your children. It could be in your work, or it could be in writing, say. That's how I see philosophical work. That's what gives it meaning, that is contributing to something good, trying to improve something, people's understanding of something, and thereby hopefully the world. That's what one can be satisfied about at the end of life. And that's what one will be remembered for, positively be recognized for.
You think for students currently, what would doing something good look like?
It must be very personal. It really depends on who one is, what one's situation in life is, what's the kind of circumstances in what one live, in which one lives, what one profession is, what one capacities are, etc. And people have different talents, capacities, etc. So there's only something that I can do. I can do what I can do in writing, in teaching, and then of course I can do something within my family, perhaps for my friends, etc. Someone in politics, say, can have a lot of a major influence, kind of more or less immediate influence to the lives of many people. And then what's the point of that? Well, obviously to do something good. That's what people are elected for when they're elected for political office.
Would you say it's also important not to compare what you do as good to others? And that it's very personal, that process of figuring out how you want to be good to others.
Yeah, so thinking of from this kind of social perspective, a kind of collective or holistic perspective, kind of life is a collective or collaborative enterprise. We live our lives with others, and we contribute to each other's life in multiple or myriads of ways. So what is a good contribution that I can do is not something that's only up to me to decide. It's very much for the others to judge, or for the collective to judge what actually would be a valuable contribution that I could make to the social cooperation or the kind of common good, so to say. But then there's the other thing, kind of what good can I do for myself in such a way that I enjoy living my life. I could of course sacrifice myself for the common good, but that's probably not going to be a very happy or satisfying life. It could be satisfying in some regards. Maybe it suits some characters better than others. But there are all kinds of things one need to do for oneself to live a satisfying, successful, healthy life, etc. Take care of your health. Take care of your physical health. Take care of your mental health. Take care of your economic circumstances to the extent that you can, not doing very stupid decisions if one can avoid that, etc. Those are kind of things that one can do for oneself and should do oneself, but they also will affect others around one. So all of that also then comes down to one's on others. So say if I as a member of a family don't take care of myself, it's going to have negative impacts on my family members. They're going to be miserable or unhappy if I'm miserable and unhappy. So all of that, even the kind of most kind of personal things are also related to other people always. So basically, to make people around oneself happy, part of that is trying to make oneself happy, so that one is someone who is nice to be around.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Thank you very much for coming on. Yeah, any final words?
No, that's it. Thanks a lot, Johnny.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
There.
Great.